Most empires collapse when they reach their peak, but Britain did something far stranger. Instead of falling, it learned how to change shape. It learned how to rule without always ruling directly, how to control without always being seen. And during this middle age of the British Empire, it stopped being just a powerful nation and became something far more dangerous, a global system. By the early 1700s, Britain was no longer desperate. It was confident. Its ships crossed every major ocean. Its traders had footholds on every major continent. Its navy was feared. Its merchants were wealthy. And its influence was quietly spreading into places where flags were not yet planted. This was no longer an empire scrambling for survival. This was an empire learning how to manage power. London became the center of the world, not in name, but in function. Decisions made in smoky rooms, in quiet offices, and in private clubs rippled across oceans. Prices in India changed. Wars in Africa began. Crops in the Caribbean shifted, and most people living under British influence never even saw a British soldier. They felt Britain through taxes, laws, trade rules, and invisible borders. This was the age of control without chaos. Instead of reckless conquest, Britain now focused on stability. It wanted predictable profits, predictable trade, and predictable obedience. Railroads were built not for local people, but to move resources faster. Ports were expanded not for tourism, but for shipping. Schools were opened not just to educate, but to teach British values, British law, and British thinking. And it worked. Entire generations grew up speaking English, studying British textbooks, and seeing the world through British rules. The empire no longer needed constant violence. It had reshaped minds. But behind this polished image of order, something darker was growing. The Middle Age of the British Empire was also its most unequal. Wealth poured into Britain from every direction, but it did not flow back. While London glittered, entire regions were drained. Crops were exported while locals starved. Industries were destroyed so British factories could thrive. Nations were turned into suppliers, not partners. And when people resisted, Britain did not hesitate. Rebellions in India were crushed. Uprisings in Africa were silenced. Protests in the Caribbean were broken. The empire spoke softly, but it carried an enormous stick. What made this phase so powerful was not just military strength, but administration paperwork, bureaucracy, maps, census records, legal codes. Britain learned that controlling people didn't always require chains. Sometimes it just required forms. If your land wasn't on a British map, it didn't exist. If your customs weren't in British law, they didn't matter. If your language wasn't English, it wasn't useful. This was not just conquest of land, it was a conquest of identity. And yet, from the outside, the empire looked calm, civilized, and orderly. British newspapers celebrated progress. Museums filled with treasures taken from across the world. Exhibitions displayed colonized cultures like artifacts, frozen in time, stripped of their stories. To the British public, the empire felt noble. To those living inside it, it often felt suffocating. This middle period was also when Britain became the world's banker. London's financial institutions funded railways in South America, mines in Africa, ports in Asia, and wars in Europe. Even countries Britain did not rule directly, often depended on British money. And dependency is a quiet form of control. If you owe someone, you obey them. Slowly, subtly, the empire wove itself into the global economy so deeply that removing it seemed impossible. Britain no longer needed to conquer everything. It just needed to be necessary. But something was changing. As the empire aged, cracks began to show. Educated elites in colonies began reading about freedom, democracy, and rights ideas that Britain itself preached but rarely practiced abroad. Soldiers who fought for Britain in distant wars returned home asking uncomfortable questions. Workers noticed that their labor built wealth they would never enjoy. Resentment began to grow. Not loudly at first, but quietly, in conversations, in classrooms, in newspapers, in secret meetings. Britain, sensing this shift, tried to adapt. It offered limited self-rule in some regions. It allowed local councils. It trained native administrators, but always ultimate power remained in British hands. It was not freedom, it was management. This was the paradox of Britain's Middle Age. It wanted loyalty, but refused equality. It wanted peace, but enforced obedience. It wanted admiration, but demanded submission. And that contradiction could not last forever. Then came the wars that changed everything. World War I shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility. Britain won, but at an enormous cost. Millions were dead. The economy was strained. The empire was shaken. Colonies that had sent soldiers and supplies now expected respect, and they did not receive it. World War II was even worse. Britain fought bravely, but emerged weakened, indebted, and exhausted. It was no longer the unchallenged global power it once was, and this time the world noticed. The middle-aged empire was now old, and old empires are fragile. One by one, independence movements surged India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Malaysia, and dozens more. Some were peaceful, others were bloody, but all carried the same message. The world had changed. Britain tried to hold on, but it could not. The Middle Age of the British Empire had taught it how to rule efficiently, but it had also taught its subjects how to resist intelligently. They used Britain's own language, its own laws, its own ideals against it. And that was something Britain never fully anticipated. Yet even as its territory slipped away, its influence did not. English remained the language of business. British legal systems remained the foundation of courts worldwide. British-style education shaped leaders across continents. British culture spread through books, films, and institutions. The empire of land faded, but the empire of influence did not. And that is what makes the Middle Age of the British Empire so important. It was the moment Britain stopped being just a conqueror and became an architect of the modern world. The rules you live under today? Trade systems, banking structures, legal norms, borders, many of them were shaped during this period, not by accident, but by design. This wasn't just history, it was engineering. That's the true legacy of Britain's Middle Age. Not its flags, not its armies. Yes. But its systems. Because systems outlive empires. And once you see them, you can never unsee them.